Okay, welcome back. Section 3 here, we're going to see the road to Lexington and Concord. So we're about to see our first battle of the American Revolution. One American story. At dawn on April 19th, 1775, we have Captain John Parker and 70 of his men stood on the grassy common at the center of Lexington, a village near Boston. The men under Parker's command belonged to the local militia, which is a force of armed civilians pledged to defend their community. About one-third of the Lexington militia, who are Minutemen, colonists trained to be ready to act at a minute's warning. A soldier described what happened next. There suddenly appeared a number of King's troops. They were on a quick pace towards us, with 3 officers in their front on horseback and on full gallop towards us, the most foremost of which cried, throw down your arms, you civilians, you villains, you rebels. Quote from John Robbins in his pamphlet Redcoats and Rebels. Captain Parker was wounded and 8 of his men were killed in the first fighting of the War of Independence. Colonial protests had turned into violent revolution. So we had talked about previously Sam Adams particularly, and how colonists were growing more and more violent in their protests against the British. And here we have absolute rebellion. We have a revolution against Britain. To add to the Declaratory Acts, to add to the Townshend Acts, until they were repealed. Remember, the tea tax remained. Now we have something new that Britain is going to place on the colonies, and this is going to be the line in which we do choose to cross, and we do choose to battle with Britain. This is the point right here where we realize there's no choice left but to fight, and it's with the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Tea Party infuriated Parliament. One British official said the people of Boston ought to be knocked about their ears. King George III declared, "We must master them or totally leave them to themselves and treat them as aliens." Britain chose to master the colonies. So we're going to see here with the Intolerable Acts, this is the point of no return. No return. Britain is laying down the law. We are crossing that line, and we're ready for open rebellion. That open rebellion is going to lead us to the event that we just read right here at the Battle of Lexington. Attacks on rights and liberties. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws to punish colonists, Massachusetts colonies, and to clamp down on resistance in other colonies. So the purpose of these were to punish us. The British called these laws the coercive acts, but they were so harsh that the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. Same name for the same thing. Two different names for the same thing. These acts were a direct attack on colonists' traditional rights and liberties because this is what the Intolerable Acts said. This is what they did. They closed the port of Boston until colonists paid for the destroyed tea. Altered the Massachusetts charter to ban town meetings, so no more public assembly. Huge issue right here. We couldn't even meet together in a group. Replaced the elected council with an appointed one, so no longer the colonists who they chose to preside over their council. Now Britain chose who. An increase in the governor's power over the colonists. Protected British officials accused of crimes in the colonies from being tried by colonists, so the British could only be tried by the British to keep the colonists from exercising any harsh retaliation for these intolerable acts towards the British. Allowed British officers to house troops in private dwellings. So this was going to be a huge issue right here. British officers, they can take their troops, their men, and they can put them in anybody's house that they want. To enforce the acts, Parliament appointed General Thomas Gage, who we've already seen, governor of Massachusetts. Remember, Gage was he was over those 1,000 British soldiers in Boston. where the Boston Massacre was. So same guy, Thomas Gage. They make him governor of Massachusetts. We have some inserts right here. Looking at these fairly quick, these political cartoons. The colonists, this is how they saw themselves. They saw themselves as prisoners in Boston, and these are like the political leaders, the Sons of Liberty type people, and the colonists in the town are kind of helping them out by feeding them fish. But this shows that the Intolerable Acts kind of imprisoned these men, that they felt imprisoned by it. We continue. In result to that, what do we get? Oh, computer's being kind of slow right now. We get the First Continental Congress, their meeting in 1772. So in 1772, Sam Adams had written, "I wish we could arouse the continent." The Intolerable Acts answered his wish. Other colonies immediately offered Massachusetts their support. They sent food and money to Boston. The committees of correspondence also called for a meeting of colonial delegates to discuss what to do next. So it's time to talk. What are we going to do? How are we going to organize to fight the British? Or are we going to fight the British? Are we going to continue the protests? What are we going to do? 1774. So now we're 1774. Delegates from all of the colonies except for Georgia met in Philadelphia. At this time, called the First Continental Congress. So here we go. Very important. First Continental Congress. The delegates voted to ban all trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. They also called on each colony to begin training troops. Georgia agreed to be part of the actions of the Congress, even though it had not voted to send delegates. So everybody was on board. Just Georgia wasn't, they just didn't send a delegate or a representative for Georgia. The First Continental Congress marked a key step in American history. Although most delegates were not ready to call for independence, they weren't ready for this just yet. That wouldn't come about to the Second Continental Congress. They were determined to uphold colonial rights. This meeting planned the seeds of a future independent government. John Adams called it a nursery of American statesmen. The delegates agreed to meet again in 7 months. Now, a nursery of statesmen, because from these continental congresses, you're going to get your first man. Like Second Continental Congress, you get Washington. He shows up for it. You get men like Adams, get men like Jefferson. All those founding fathers, they're part of this. So that's why he calls it a nursery of American statesmen, because that's where all these great statesmen that helped to start our country came from. Another political cartoon that shows the complete opposite we have in London. Over back in Britain, this is one of their political cartoons, quite different. They see the colonists as evil and that they are tar and feathering, which actually some of them did. British officials, that they're harassing, and they're kind of like, I like this word that they use right here, they portrayed us as thugs, being mean to the Tories, those who supported the king. So a different perspective on it. Depends on which country you're in. Depends on where your allegiance lies. British control begins to slip. Here we see the colonists hope that another trade boycott would force a repeal of the Intolerable Acts. So after it, past boycotts had left to the repeal of the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. So they're thinking, well, the Stamp Act, the sugar, the Townshend, all of these we protested, and they went away. We protested them, and Parliament made them go away. So perhaps this time we can do the same thing. This time, however, Parliament stood firm. So here we see Parliament stands firm. And it even increased restrictions on the colonial trade and sent more troops in the colonies. So it's not going to plan. However, in the countryside, British authorities were already losing control of government. Although throughout the colonies, Americans acted forcefully to reestablish the rights that Parliament was taking away. In the summer of 1774, In towns throughout Massachusetts, large crowds gathered to prevent British appointed judges from holding court. They also forced many unelected officials to resign. In defiance of the royal governor, the people of Massachusetts elected a provincial Congress with the power to collect its own taxes and raise its own money. So we're kind of by force ignoring and shoving away these royal governors. By the end of 74, some colonists were preparing to fight. So we see this right here, this return to being violent, to acting out, to fighting back. In Massachusetts, John Hancock headed the Committee of Safety, which had the power to call out the militia. In Virginia, however, House of Burgess member Patrick Henry delivered his famous speech calling for war. And we looked at this in the first video. We had saw his quote that includes the famous lines, "Give me liberty or give me death," from Patrick Henry. So here we are in 1774. We have it delivered. But most colonial leaders believed that any fight with Britain would be short. They thought a public show of force would make the British Parliament change its politics. So we're going to see the revolution begin. So this boycott, this forced resistance to Britain doesn't really do what the colonists originally wanted it to do. We're going to go to a commercial break. Then when we come back, we are going to look at the revolution begins.
The tall man with a high hat and a whiskers on his chin will soon be knocking at your door, and you ought to be in. The tall man with the high hat will be coming down your way. Get your savings out when you hear him shout, "Any bonds today?" Come on and get 'em, folks. Come on, skip right up and get 'em. Any bonds today? Bonds of freedom, that's what I'm selling. Any bonds today? Scrape up the most you can. Here comes the freedom man, asking you to buy a share of freedom today. Many stamps today. Give kiddies. We'll be blessed if we all invest in the USA. Sammy, my Uncle Sammy.
Here comes the freedom man.
Can't make tomorrow's plan.
Not unless you buy a share of freedom today. Any stamps, any bonds today.
Back. Here we are. We're looking at the revolution, how the revolution begins. Since 1770, Sam Adams had been using a network of informants to keep watch over British activities. The British had their spies, too. It was from these spies that General Gage learned that the Massachusetts militia was storing arms and ammunition in Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. So think, why are they storing arms and ammunition in Concord? Why are the colonists storing ammunition there? Think back to what we read and looked at previously. He also heard that Sam Adams and John Hancock were nearby in Lexington on the night of April 18th, 1775. Gage ordered his troops to arrest Adams and Hancock in Lexington and to destroy the supplies in Concord. So that's the plan. That's the British plan right there. To arrest Adams, to arrest Hancock, and to destroy the supplies in Concord. The Midnight Ride, here we are. Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. The Sons of Liberty had prepared for this moment. Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith, and a second messenger, William Dowles, were sent to spread the news about British troop movements. Revere would cross the harbor from Boston to Charleston. From there, he would ride to Lexington and Concord. Dawes would take the land route. Revere had arranged a system of signals to alert colonists across the harbor in Charleston. One lantern burned in the Old North Church steeple signaled that the British troops were taking the land route out of Boston. Two lamps meant that the troops were leaving Boston by water. So we will come back to New Englanders oppose the king, and we're going to look here and see how the battle begins. When the British moved, so did Revere and Dowes. They galloped over the countryside on their midnight ride, spreading the news. In Lexington, they were joined by Dr. Samuel Prescott. When Revere and Dowes were stopped by a British patrol, Prescott broke away and carried the message to Concord, Lexington, and Concord. At dawn on April 19, 1775, more than 700 British troops reached Lexington. So here we are. The first set of troops reached Lexington. There they found Captain John Parker and about 70 militiamen waiting. The British commander ordered the Americans to drop their muskets. Of course, the colonists refused. No one knows who fired first, but within a few minutes, 8 militiamen lay dead. So we have 8 dead. The British then marched to Concord, and where they destroyed military supplies. Battle broke out at a bridge north of town, forcing the British to retreat. Over 4,000 militiamen and minutemen and militiamen arrived in the area. So originally there were 7 at Lexington, and then whenever they make it to Concord, there's 4,000. They lined the road from Concord to Lexington and peppered the retreating redcoats with musket fire. So they just shot into the air and they let it rain down on where the British troops were. It seemed as if the men came from the clouds. One British soldier later recalled, only the arrival of 1,000 more troops saved the British from total destruction as they scrambled back to Boston. So the British had roughly 1,700 at one point, versus the colonists who had over 4,000. Lexington and Concord were the first battles of the Revolutionary War. As Ralph Waldo Emerson later wrote, colonial troops had fired the shot heard around the world. And there we are, the famous saying, shot heard around the world. Americans would now have to choose sides and back up their political beliefs by force of arms. Those who supported the British were called loyalists because they remained loyal to Britain. And those who sided with the rebels were known as patriots. The revolution had begun. So war has begun. Wanted to go back up for just a moment and look at this connecting history. New Englanders oppose the king. Look at this picture here as I talk a little bit about what's in the little text right here. And this goes back to the age. I'm sorry, not the age. Goes back to the about a century before with the Puritans. New Englanders had a long history of fierce opposition to royal authority. During the English Civil War of the 1640s, many New England Puritans returned to England to fight the king. They rejoiced when a republic was set up in England following the king's execution. Over a century later, in the 1760s and 1770s, descendants of the Puritans were still angered by the same issues that had upset their ancestors: the levying of taxes, the extent of the king's power, and the creation of a standing army that might threaten their freedom. So this is 1649. What they're saying right here is that it was Englishmen, particularly the Puritans, that were angry with the king, and then 100 years later, 1770, we're 5 right now, it's Englishmen, but just remember, these colonists were originally Englishmen, but now they are colonists who are seeing themselves separate from England, and they're still mad at who? Still mad at the king. And now they're willing to go that extra mile and that extra effort and that extra risk of potentially losing their lives, losing what they already have, to obtain liberty. Okay, this is the end of section 3. In the next section, we will look at the events of the American Revolution.